I don't need to preach.
But I'm going to anyhow. Thank you very much to all of you who shared.
Apostle Paul wrote in 2 Timothy chapter 4, "For I am already being poured out like a drink offering, and the time has come for my departure. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race, I have kept the faith. Now there is in store for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day. And not only to me, but also to all who have from his appearing." Also, Paul wrote those words towards the end of his life. We don't know exactly when it was. From the experience he had on the road to Damascus until he penned these words was probably around 30 years. In that 30 years, from Jesus appearing to him to approaching the end of his life, Paul's entire life revolved around his relationship with Jesus and his ministry carrying the gospel to people who didn't know Jesus. As we read this short passage, as we see these words of a man who knows that his race is nearly done, as he approaches the end of his life, he has no regrets. He didn't look at his life and say, "I wish things had been different." He isn't hurrying towards death. He isn't looking at death as some sort of an escape from an unbearable existence. On the other hand, he's saying, death isn't something to be avoided. It's not something to be delayed. He has no fear of an uncertain future. He has no trepidation of what is to come. For Paul, as he wrote elsewhere, to live is Christ.
I was good.
Death is not the end. It's the beginning. It's hard for us. Dawn, I love what you shared, saying when your dad would, "Do you believe?" And you struggle perhaps a little bit with that because we do. For us, we live in this finite existence. We know when we were born, and in our entire experience, we know that people die, and we know that we too will come to that point. And so we have this very finite view of existence, this 60 or 70 or 80 or 90 some years, very finite. And so when we look into that future and say, "I don't know what's there." But for Paul and for Dick, he knew. He knew that this finite existence that we're living on this earth is not real life. He knew that this body is not who we really are. To live is Christ, to die is gain. I suspect that in his last months, or perhaps the last few years, that he looked at the prospect of death in the same sort of way as did Paul. When Pastor Jonathan met with Joyce and I think some of the other family, he took copious notes for which I was grateful. And he sent me those notes. And in the notes, he said, "Joyce, that perhaps you didn't really know how close Dick was to death because he never complained. He remained full of joy. Some people look at that and say, how? Well, it was because for nearly 80 years, he lived the same kind of life that the Apostle Paul lived. Dick was not a one-dimensional man. I look at the casket and I see a flag. That's important. He served his country. He wasn't the one-dimensional man. There were many aspects, and we've heard some of them from Grandpa. I understand he was an entrepreneur, businessman, certainly a family man. But his center was Jesus. You may have noticed that the obituary contains an acrostic, Father. I tried to emphasize the words of the acrostic as I read it. If you didn't catch it, look at the obituary and try to find that acrostic in there, Father. It starts with faith. His faith in Jesus Christ informed everything else in his life. And like Paul, Dick's greatest joy was sharing his faith with others. You heard from Don and grandsons. He would share his faith with anyone who would listen. I asked a couple of the daughters as we had our time of visitation, I said, did he embarrass you when you were kids? And they both said, oh yeah. And as I read Jonathan's notes about meeting with the family, I could just imagine being a 12-year-old in some store and Dad going, let me share Jesus with you. Despite the embarrassment, what a legacy. You see, he understood there was nothing more important than a relationship with Jesus Christ. His passion for sharing the good news was so strong that he looked forward to telemarketers calling. So he could tell them about something better than whatever it was they were selling. I understand that they quit calling. Is that true? Yeah. I know what I'm going to try. What a wonderful thing. What a wonderful opportunity. Maybe you're like me and you just get irritated with the telemarketers. Dick had a better thing. Peter instructs us, always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. And Dick did. His hope can probably be best expressed in the words of Job. For I know that my Redeemer lives, and he will stand at last on the earth. And after my skin is destroyed, yet in my flesh I will see God, whom I will see for myself, and my eyes will behold, and not another. How my heart yearns within me. The family all know the story. I've never heard his testimony, so you know it better than I, but I understand that he came to faith in Jesus Christ in relationship when he was 16 years old. At 16, he discovered for himself what he had heard about from others. God loved him so much that Jesus came to this earth to live among men and die on a cross for his sins and my sins and your sins. And that after being crucified, he was buried, and after 3 days in the grave, he came out of the grave, and that he's alive today. That's the gospel. That's the good news. I love the way Job ends the passage. Oh, my heart yearns within me. For nearly 80 years, Dick lived with the hope, the knowledge that his Redeemer lived and that he would one day see him face to face. And that yearning is why the Apostle Paul and Dick. And those of us who have the assurance that Jesus is in us and that we are in him can say, to live is Christ, to die is gain. The first passage I read as I welcomed you this morning is from the first letter to the churches of Thessalonica. Some of those Christians were concerned that Jesus had either already returned or that their Christian friends and family who had died wouldn't share in the hope of eternity with Christ. So Paul wrote in Ken's very loose translation, don't grieve like non-Christians. Because Jesus rose from the dead, we will rise from the dead. And Paul went on to write, it doesn't matter if your body is alive or dead. When the day of the Lord comes, all of us who experience the new birth will join Jesus for eternity. If you read that whole passage, Paul ends, depending upon the translation, therefore, encourage one another or comfort one another with this. Joyce, Christine, Colleen, Mark, Dawn, grandkids, friends, you watch Dick live his life in the hope of eternity with Jesus Christ. So don't grieve as others who have no hope. Comfort each other, encourage one another with the certainty that Dick is exactly where he wanted to be. Please bow your heads with me.